Welcome to the Gold Report, where we hope to inspire you to be 10% more courageous in your daily life. I'm so glad you're here. Please like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We have an exciting guest on the show, and I will introduce him after this short break.
Somebody comes to us when they are the most vulnerable. We have an obligation to our patients to tell the truth as we learned it and to not politicize it. We are performing surgeries on these children, and the only people benefiting is the medical industrial complex, because the more surgeries that are done, the more money it is made.
Whether you're talking about an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 14-year-old, I don't see how you can actually derive informed consent.
We all know that we can't be getting true informed consent.
Our medical industry has objectively been compromised in more ways than one.
You become familiar with the sound a mother makes when you tell her that her child is dead.
Chris Elston is known as Billboard Chris on X. He is a father of 2 girls from Vancouver, Canada. Since 2020, he has spent his time traveling the world, having street conversations, visiting university campuses, generating media, and reaching millions of people about the dangers of gender ideology, specifically the practice of giving children harmful puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, and mutilating surgeries. Chris strongly believes that no child is born in the wrong body. He's made it his mission to raise awareness about radical gender ideology policies in order to end the abusive practice of childhood medical mutilation. His message is one of positivity, that children are beautiful just as they are. He has recently spoken before the UN Human Rights Council, and along with Elon Musk, is suing the Australian government on what could be a precedent-setting freedom of speech case. We're very happy to have Billboard Chris with us today. So first of all, I want to welcome you to the show because it's the first time you've been here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor. Thank you for all you've done to create awareness about all these various censorious things going on in our world, trying to harm our kids and ourselves.
For sure. So you know that I got started on this fight because I just saw our physicians participating in just terrible disinformation propaganda in 2020. Prior to that, I was working as a board certified emergency physician for many, many years. And I knew that there was a lot of government control over how patients were being treated. But in general, I was always able to bypass, protocols or, preferences that the government might have had by just advocating for the patient. It was difficult and became more difficult every year, but I was able to do that. But during COVID, all of a sudden, doctors who wanted to do the right thing by their patient actually couldn't do the right thing by their patient. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. That's why I stepped out of this lane. I'm very interested in knowing why you've become so fierce in this lane, this terrible lane of the gender ideologues who are pushing mutilating procedures and medications on our children. Why is this something that you've become so passionate about and honestly so fiercely advocating against?
Yeah, I guess I should give a little bit of a background. I used to have a real job in the world. I was a financial advisor. And I'm a dad. I have 2 girls. So that's, as any parent knows, that's your real job in the world. Everything else you do is really for them and trying to leave a positive legacy for them. And you hope to send them out into a world that they can thrive and prosper in. And as an investment advisor for, I guess, 19 years, I was seeing the world kind of spiral downwards. I didn't really like the direction we were heading in. And then I started learning about this business of child transition, trying to change the sex of children, giving kids puberty blocking drugs. And I'm going to pause there because when I first came upon that term, puberty blockers, I paused. This was 2019. And I said, what the heck are puberty blockers? That doesn't sound good. And of course, as you research this, they are exactly what they sound like. We're giving drugs to kids who are perfectly healthy physically. Obviously, they're having some mental distress, but there's nothing wrong with them. And we are stopping their physical development. If that doesn't give you pause, to say what the heck is going on, I would challenge you to maybe look inwards a little bit, because all throughout history of humanity, we've done all sorts of crazy things. This is right up there, stopping the development of children. But it doesn't stop there. We then give them the opposite sex hormones. Now, this isn't something being done to a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old. This is being done to 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds, even 8-year-olds have received cross-sex hormones. Johanna Olsen Kennedy, who runs the gender clinic at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, received a grant. The total grant was about $10 million, but as part of this grant, she received approval from the NIH to give cross-sex hormones to 8-year-olds, provided they've already hit Tanner stage 2 of puberty, which is the beginning of puberty. These are just very small kids. They were in diapers 5 years ago. Now we're giving them cross-sex hormones, teaching them they were born in the wrong body. And this is a craze really impacting girls. This condition known as gender dysphoria, which I would challenge almost every case of this and say this is not gender dysphoria, this is something else going on with these kids. But this condition known as gender dysphoria, this distress surrounding our sex, affecting really a handful of the population, used to affect maybe 1 out of 30,000 kids, starting from a young age, and it was mostly boys. Today, we have all these preteen and teenaged girls now identifying as boys. They're having a tough time in life for various reasons. And no questions asked. The standard today is one appointment, and they will prescribe puberty blockers to these kids. So I just got tired of this madness. And I'm not going to send my girls off into this world. And I really feel compassion for all these kids and the parents who are going through this, because the parents in most cases can't even speak up about this, because then they would alienate their children. So I just felt the calling to do something about it, which is what I've been doing.
Great. I'm going to pause you there because I'm very excited about this conversation, because you and I came at the same horrific problem from different perspectives. So the things that struck me the most was that physicians are participating in this, because as you said, we've done a lot of crazy things in the history of humanity, but the worst often would enlist the expertise of somebody who society says is an elite or an expert, and they really can do damage. And I think, of course, obviously, back to the Nazi era, there was torture, and then there was medical torture, right? You can do a lot of damage when you have an MD after your name. So Johanna Kennedy Olsen, who you mentioned, she's on what we call the trans predator watch list. So trans predators are people who are benefiting in some way from this industry. In other words, it's not the child himself, and it wouldn't really be the parent who's confused or is afraid of getting into a fight or distancing with their child. The trans predator watch list are the people who are being paid either financially or through higher accolades or some social affirmation. They're getting some benefit over the mutilating of our children, and she is top of the trans predator watch list. And a couple of other things you said I want to point out to people. As a physician going through my training, I actually had taken care of some people with this condition. It was very different back in the 80s and 90s, and it was really considered a sexual dysfunction, a psychological disorder. But it was always, the patients were typically, I should say, middle-aged men who had been cross-dressing for years. In other words, they had a long history of this, and they were adults. And never would you have treated children. In fact, when you go back to the early treatment protocols for doctors, being a child excluded you from any kind of treatment of this path. Then the activists got involved, and they loosened the restrictions, and they broadened the diagnosis to include all of these people, which really should never be in this diagnosis. I agree with you completely. This is not gender dysphoria. This is something else. We could, I don't know how you feel about it, call it rapid onset gender dysphoria. I don't even like mixing the phrases because it still has that gender dysphoria in there. But you are correct that it is a different process going on. It is teenage girls. It's spreading as a social contagion. It's spreading after they're on videos and they're watching it. And they don't show kind of a lifelong tendency towards this. The people historically who had gender dysphoria, you can go back and you can look back when they were 3 years old and they had some issues. These are girls in their teenage years who are really getting exposed to a social contagion. So I'm just adding to what you said, that looking at this problem as a physician, the phrase gender dysphoria has been completely hijacked from what it really means as a diagnosis to encompass and medicalize something that shouldn't be in that category? I just wanted to kind of validate that for you, and I'm glad you
Yes.
mentioned it.
Yes, thank you. And with these men, there's different typographies here. There are different types of trans. With these men who transition in middle age, for them, this is almost invariably a sexual fetish called autogynephilia, which literally means attraction to oneself as a woman. And this is a sexual thing for them. They are probably watching too much porn, to be honest with you. Even Bruce Jenner, his family found out about this, now Caitlyn Jenner, when he came home and he was trying on his daughter's underwear. This is totally different than what's going on with kids. And as you mentioned, these little 3-year-old boys in the past, back in the 70s or 80s, who were really effeminate and maybe wanted to be girls. Well, we have studies into this. And the most recent study that was completed before we started drugging these kids, this study finished in 2004, and it followed 139 boys from when they were really little, 3, 4, 5, all the way into their 20s. 87.8% of them saw their gender dysphoria desist. They grew out of it when they went through puberty. Now, we block puberty. We block the cure. And interestingly, in all these different studies, which are up on my website, billboardchris.com, a majority of those kids grew up to be gay. It was 63.6% to be exact. So the left want to talk about conversion therapy. They pass all these bills saying it's conversion therapy to help a child feel comfortable with their sex. And they lump this in with, trying to turn a gay person straight because that's how they buy support for these bills. The real conversion therapy going on is telling a perfect little girl that she was born wrong, that she was born in the wrong body, and that she's supposed to be something she's not. What an abusive message, never mind all the physical harm that follows.
So that's fantastic. And I'm so glad you mentioned about the middle-aged male and the differences. So you were struck very much by the phrase puberty blockers. And maybe let's run through, the puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries. Just have at it.
Sure. So I'm not a doctor, but, I do know how to read. And this is pretty simple stuff. These puberty blocker drugs, these are gonadotropin releasing hormone analogs for all the doctors watching this. And they stop the pituitary gland from releasing a couple hormones called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These in turn trigger testosterone in boys, estrogen in girls. And these hormones, which naturally occur at the onset of puberty, are what trigger our secondary sex characteristics to develop. So girls grow breasts, boys' genitals would grow, etc. We all understand what happens during puberty. On these drugs, that won't occur. Now, if you were to steelman the trans activist argument, the argument for this is it will be too traumatic if a child develops their secondary sex characteristics. It'll be too traumatic because then it'll be harder for them to pass as the opposite sex. So they block puberty to keep them looking neutral. Then they give them the opposite sex's hormones. Again, we're talking about 10 and 11-year-olds here. Many of these children still believe in Santa Claus. And we don't know the long-term impacts of any of this because there's never been a clinical trial. You cannot do an ethical clinical trial, obviously. You can't take some children and block their puberty because they're lost and confused and not do it to others in a control group. The NHS is about to start a trial in the UK. It's not ethical. They need to stop it. I don't think we need a trial to tell us that we shouldn't be blocking puberty in children. This is a perfectly normal biological function. But that's the argument for it. And this originally started in the Netherlands. In the late 90s, they gave this to a girl. Then they did a small study. I think around 2010 it completed. This was called the Dutch protocol. But under the Dutch protocol, which is still a mess, and this study's never been able to be recreated with the same results, under the Dutch protocol, they were screening for other mental health comorbidities. They would screen for autism, abuse, trauma, sexual abuse, etc. When this was imported into the United States, they eliminated some of those safeguards right away. And now today, they really don't have any safeguards, to the point where at the annual general meeting for WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, a couple years ago, during the opening ceremony, some protesters got up and said they need to abolish therapy for gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder, whatever you want to call it, that they need to abolish therapy completely. Because to even suggest that a child needs therapy is to suggest that there's something wrong with their gender identity. It's invalidating their gender identity. So this whole thing is completely mental, to be honest. This is essentially a cult which has grabbed the entire Western world And we need to put a stop to it because
Right.
it's being pushed by all of our leftist governments and all of these international bodies, and it's being funded by NGOs, which are, as we've seen with the U.S. Agency for International Development, those NGOs themselves are being funded by the government.
So a couple things you said that are super interesting. So in the Western world, the kind of permission to do all this was based on this very small study that you mentioned, the Dutch study. And you correctly said that in addition to us removing the safeguards that they already had in place, other scientists have not been able to reproduce the supposedly positive results of the Dutch study. So what I want to share with the audience is that the way things work in medicine and science is somebody will discover something in their research area, and people will jump on it and say, oh, that's pretty interesting. Let me do that study again, or slightly different, or larger, or something. And the study has to be reproducible for it to be considered valid. That's just a core tenet of scientific research, that if one person discovers something and it cannot be reproduced, that is not considered valid. And I was very struck as somebody who only started looking at this issue 1 to 2 years ago, how it was not reproducible. So there's that. I also learned, as you know, that these puberty blockers, the transgender activists are making it sound really benign, like, oh, we just delay puberty and da da da. Absolutely not. They're harmful for many reasons. One is they're harmful in and of themselves. If you're on puberty blockers for 2 years or more, you actually risk a lot of medical problems that you wouldn't otherwise risk. They're also harmful because you are locking in, as you said at the beginning, you're locking in, or you're locking out, I should say, really the treatment of the cure, that most people will pass through these issues. And if you just let them go through puberty, they'll lock it out. And the third is that you're actually making it more likely that much more likely that the child will then proceed on the more permanent treatments, because they're already on that path. They're getting a lot of social affirmation and positive accolades for being on that path. And it becomes very difficult to get them off that path. It's like on a treadmill and, not getting off. Puberty blockers are absolutely not benign. I agree with you completely. There is no way to do an ethical human trial on giving a child. It's lunacy, right? It's absolute lunacy.
Total lunacy. Yeah.
It's lunacy.
I'm so glad you mentioned that we have what we have going on with these kids, and this is according to the Gender Identity Development Service in England, part of the National Health Service, from their own data. And these are thousands of kids. So from their own data, 70% of the children had 5 or more coexisting mental health comorbidities. So trauma, depression, anxiety, sexual abuse, trauma, autism. Honestly, these numbers I'm going to tell you are modest. According to the Tavistock, again in the UK, out of a sample of 1,069 kids, 35% had moderate to severe autism. And I'm telling you for sure, these numbers are lowballed. I was just hanging out with the lawyers of Campbell Miller Payne in Texas last week. They started a law firm just to sue for these kids. They have, I think, 13 lawsuits ongoing. They're looking at another 150. And pretty much every single one of those cases, this child is on the autism spectrum.
That's another thing I learned over the last couple of years, is that I thought, when I was first looking at this, that perhaps the social contagion, affects all these teenage girls. And in fact, no, it can affect anyone, that's for sure. But there's a much higher preponderance. It's much higher than 35%. It's like 65, 70%. And perhaps it's closer to 100. I don't know. But what I've read is 65, 70% have another diagnosis, typically autism, depression, or anxiety. So let's just take a moment there and think about the fact that we're taking the most vulnerable young people. Young people are vulnerable by definition. And now we're taking the most vulnerable of a vulnerable population and doing these horrific things. It really offends me, not only to be putting a harmful medicalization on vulnerable kids, but also that we're actually ignoring what is really going on. I mean, a lot of these kids, when you talk with them, have either been sexually abused, had some degree of autism, some degree of childhood or family trauma that's going on. And there's so many examples of those issues being flagrantly ignored once you tell the family or the child that it's gender dysphoria, and that's all the doctors or people pay attention to. I find it very offensive. And it's because of my training as an emergency physician or any physician. If somebody comes into you and they have, for example, congestive heart failure, it doesn't mean they don't also have emphysema or diabetes or something else. You do not stop when you get one diagnosis. It's a well-known teaching that we doctors are told when we're looking at an x-ray and we see the broken bone, we are trained to force ourselves to look at the rest of the x-ray because there can be another issue in addition to that broken bone. That is part of our training. And all of a sudden on this issue, you label gender dysphoria on the child's chart and nobody pays attention to the autism, nobody pays attention to the depression and the family trauma. And I wish all these doctors lost their licenses because it violates everything I know to be true as a doctor.
Yes, and with these girls in particular, the boys too, but sexual abuse is extremely common. I was speaking with Dr. Quentin Van Meter. Perhaps you know him. He was president of the American College of Pediatricians. He's still a practicing pediatrician, and he estimates about 60% of these kids have suffered sexual abuse. And just to make this real for all the viewers watching this, let me tell you a real life story, and you can even watch this video. You can find it on my X or YouTube account. So I have my nickname Billboard Chris because originally back in September of 2020, I put up a billboard in Vancouver, Canada, where I'm from, my lovely communist country. I put up this billboard that said, "I love J.K. Rowling." I was following the lead of this woman in the UK who had put up a sign at the Edinburgh train station that said the same thing. "I love J.K. Rowling," the Harry Potter author. She, of course, has spoken out about all this madness. That first sign that was put up got taken down the next day because of hate speech. And I got tired of our freedom of speech coming under attack. And I said, forget this. I was reading Harry Potter every night with my little one, by the way. And I put up a big billboard on the side of the street in Vancouver that said the same thing. "I love J.K. Rowling." It also lasted just one day. A Vancouver politician named Sarah Kirby Young said it was hate speech. And she pressured the sign company and they took it down. I was ready for that. I did a quick little campaign and had billboards up all throughout the US, including Times Square at the end of September 2020. And then because no one in Canada would work with me, no sign companies would work with me, and I had this vision to start millions of conversations, which is what I'm trying to do. I said, well, you can take down my billboard, but you can't take one off my back. So I quit my job and I had some signs made and I wear them just because it's easier than holding them. And I walk around downtown centers. I walk around university campuses. I travel the world having one conversation at a time because that's the only way I had a means of spreading the truth. So that's where my nickname comes from. But what was I going to say? We
I
were
just have
talking
to
about,
say that you
yeah,
are so inspiring because so many people say to me, I can't be you. I'm not a doctor and a lawyer. Everyone can do something. And that is amazing. That is an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah, it was pretty wild. And I get attacked and all sorts of stuff. I've had my arm broken by Antifa and I've been arrested a couple times after getting assaulted because it's easier to get rid of me than all the crazy people coming at me.
We
But
can,
I just stand there. I don't approach anyone. I'm just as quiet as can be. If people want to come up and have a conversation, I have one. And it's really effective, even though I look totally ridiculous wearing signs. But that's okay. I'm an old man now. I got 2 kids. I don't need to impress anyone. But I was going to say, regarding this sexual abuse of all these girls, I was at UCLA in, when was it? October, just a few months ago. I'd been there 2 minutes, and this girl, young woman, walks up to me. I think she's 19. She might have just turned 20. And her name is Clementine. And Clementine told me her story. She's a detransitioner, meaning she's no longer identifying as a man. When she was 7 years old, she'd suffered childhood sexual abuse. I'm not sure for how long, but obviously this is just wildly traumatic for a child. It made her not look forward to being a woman naturally. At the age of 12, she was struggling a bit. She was sent to her school counselor, who essentially told her that because she wasn't comfortable growing into a woman, that must mean she's trans. So the parents, having learned this information now that their daughter is trans and having this all be new to them, they did what normal parents do. And they went to the hospital, to the gender clinic, to see the expert, whose name is Johanna Olsen Kennedy. On the first appointment, and you can hear this all in Clementine's own words. She's made videos, but you can watch this raw video with me just out on the campus. She was separated from her parents on the first appointment. In a 1/2 hour appointment, she was prescribed puberty blockers, and her parents separately were told they could have a dead daughter or a live son. So at 12, she starts puberty blockers. At 13, she's having a follow-up appointment with Johanna Olsen Kennedy. And Johanna says, well, are all these boys that you're going to school with, are they going through puberty now? And she says, yeah, a lot are starting. Well, you don't want to fall behind, so we'd better start you on testosterone. This is Johanna Olsen Kennedy pushing it on her. Wasn't even Clementine's request. So now she's on testosterone. At 14, Johanna Olsen Kennedy pushes her to get a double mastectomy because she says they get better results when they do them young. Scott Mosser, the surgeon, these people are all getting sued now, by the way. Scott Mosser was the surgeon. He met Clementine on the morning of her surgery. He knew nothing about her, nothing at all, yet he's happily going to cut off the breasts of a 14-year-old girl for some money. At 17, she went off testosterone because it caused psychosis, and now she's detransitioned, and she recently just had some reconstructive surgery done. But damage is done. Very low probability she will ever be able to have kids because puberty blockers and testosterone in girls cause sterility. They often have to get a hysterectomy done because it causes vaginal and uterine atrophy. Johanna Olsen Kennedy actually wanted her to get a hysterectomy. And it was at this point she said, I've had enough of this doctor. But she's been harmed for life, and she was just an innocent child who was sent to what should be one of the most trustworthy figures in the world, the doctor at the Children's Hospital. Yet all these children's hospitals are pushing this.
I knew of Clementine's story, but you added a lot of details, and let's just talk about this. So we have heard the word infertility a lot in the last 3 to 4 decades. Infertility is rising really in a lot of Western nations for a lot of reason, but I don't want people to think that when we're talking about cases like Clementine, that we're talking about a type of sterility that is reversible. While I don't know about Clementine's situation specifically, when a girl or a boy is on these puberty blockers, what for a sufficient amount of time, what happens is that their reproductive cells don't ever develop into the adult version. So a boy, if they're on the meds long enough, never will create sperm, and a girl, if she's on it long enough, will never create eggs. That is irreversible. That is not going to be something that science in the future is ever going to be able to fix. These are permanent, irreversible medical effects. And there are so many problems with what happened here. There wasn't informed consent. Even if a physician had spoken with the family and the child for hours, I submit to you that as an attorney, it is my legal opinion. Of course, there cannot be informed consent. Here's why. You cannot give informed consent to somebody who cannot legally who's not possessing the ability to understand what you're consenting to. That's why a debilitated older adult, for example, someone's mother with dementia, will have a medical power of attorney who's an adult daughter who then can consent because they can understand what they're hearing. The child cannot understand what it means to have permanent, irreversible sterility, just as one side effect. So then you say, well, okay, the parent could consent on their behalf. And I submit to you, absolutely not. Our laws come from what's called common law precedent. Common law precedent is the law that humans have engaged in for thousands of years. Assault is known in common law. That's against the rules. Murder, all of these things are common law crimes. There is no common law precedent for one human being to consent for another human being to have a permanent mutilating effect on their body. Whether that consenting authority is a parent or the government, we don't have any legal precedent for such a situation where a teacher, doctor, parent can say, you know what, go carve up that other person's body. In fact, if a parent had come into me as a physician and said, you know, I've got my 14-year-old child and he's been misbehaving, and every time I catch him stealing, I just want to chop off his hand because he needs to learn a lesson. And if I were to do that procedure, I would go to jail, even though the parent consented to it. Now, this is the way people need to think about this, is that a child is not capable of giving informed consent to a permanent result that they can't possibly, because they're a child, possibly understand, nor can any other authority figure, not parent, not government, consent to mutilate the healthy body of another person. That is the legal analysis that needs to happen. Why these cases are, none of them are having informed consent. I don't know if you've ever thought about it in that way, Chris.
So the sign that I wear on my front since the beginning basically says children cannot consent to puberty blockers, precisely because of that, obviously. And I say all the time, I'm all about parental rights, but there's one right that parents don't have, and that's the right to abuse their children. This is why we have CPS. Now, CPS today, of course, is completely inverted, and they're going to say if a parent isn't doing this to their children, that they're abusing their kids. So we need to fix all of that too. But I just want to go over really quickly the number 1 and 2 arguments you will hear for why we need to transition kids. Number 1, and this is used every single time by these trans activists, and it was used in that first meeting with Clementine's parents, is that children will kill themselves if we don't transition them. So not only can the parents not consent to harming their own children, but these parents are being coerced and manipulated and lied to in order to go along with this. Because the only way you can justify this sort of child abuse is by saying kids will die if we don't do it. What's the evidence for this? Well, there is none. Now, there have been very few studies on children. There are more studies into suicides and suicidality with adults. But the biggest study with children came out just about a year ago from Finland, where none of these kids were lost to follow-up, which often happens. A kid goes into a gender clinic, they come out, they never hear from them again, they have no idea what happened. But these kids weren't lost to follow-up. 2,000 kids over 24 years, from 1996 to 2019, went to the gender clinic in Finland. They compared it to a control group of just about 17,000. Over the 24 years, there were 6 suicides. It worked out to on an annualized basis, 0.051%, about 1 out of 2,000. So, of course, every suicide is a tragedy, but there's no epidemic of suicides going on here. There were, I think it was 17 suicides in the control group, and the common denominator was these kids had other mental health problems going on. Obviously, it's not gender, it's just other issues. So that's just a lie. It's just used to coerce people. We even had Chase Strangio, who is a woman who says she's a man. She's the lawyer for the ACLU, who gave oral arguments at the Supreme Court in December, just a couple months ago. I was outside, speaking outside. Chase Strangio was expertly pinned down by one of the Supreme Court justices into talking about this suicide myth. And Chase Strangio even admitted, well, when we're talking about suicides, we're not talking about completed suicides. We're talking about the ideation, the idea of it. Well, gosh, yes, obviously, if a child wants to change their sex, there's something going on. They're not super happy right now. Of course, their suicidal ideation is going to be higher. It's higher with autistic kids. It's higher with all sorts of kids. But that blew up that myth. Yet they're still going to use this lie every single time. And the other one is that puberty blockers are reversible, which you just spoke to, talking about the sterility of these children, how their eggs and sperm don't properly develop. And I hear all the time, well, when they go off them, they'll just go through puberty then. That's not how puberty works. And perhaps you can speak to this a little bit, Dr. Gold, because yes, it's true. If a child at 12 years of age went on puberty blockers for a few months and then came off, puberty would resume. It might not happen right away. There might be a bit of a lag, but it would resume and not too much harm done. But we know statistically, once you start these kids on puberty blockers, from the data we have, different gender clinics, 98 to 100% of the time, depending on the clinic, they go on to the cross-sex hormones because they haven't just bought into the puberty blockers. They're not exploring their gender identity, which is the sales pitch that these leftists always give. They are fully bought into this idea that they were born in the wrong body, and what they really want is to look like the opposite sex. So puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are a tandem deal, and then it's surgeries basically as soon as they can get them. But what do you say to these people? If a child's on puberty blockers from 12 to 17, they come off. Now, I know they don't go through puberty in their late teens into their 20s, but what is the physiological reasons for that? I know that window of opportunity is gone, but how does that work?
Yeah, so I'm actually not the best expert on that, but what I will say for sure that I've learned over the last couple of years is that after I believe it's 2 years, you definitely decrease or eliminate the maturation of the person's ability to create sperm or egg. So first of all, There is a point beyond which it does become irreversible. 2 years is an average, maybe some is sooner, maybe some is longer. But part two is what you just said, which is the overwhelming majority of people that start the puberty blockers go on. I mean, it's well north of 90%. I would agree with you, 98%, 95%, but almost all of them go on to the cross-sex hormones. So that's like, being in the coffin and then slamming down the lid. It is a lie. It is a lie for gender ideologues to say that this is a reversible form of infertility. Partly
Yes.
because you don't mature the sperm and the egg, and partly because you've set the child on this course. I cringe because as a doctor, we're always trying to help people fix these problems. I mean, when a woman comes in her 30s and she's infertile and she and her husband are trying to have a baby, it's really a tragedy. It dominates their life. It's everything. And I can't even imagine if there was no hope at all. I mean, usually when there's an infertile case, it's a very low sperm count and you do things to try to help that, or it's difficulty with the eggs and you do something to try to increase the eggs or the quality of the eggs, or maybe you have a surrogate and you do a lot of things. But all of those options are cut off in these cases. And I'm angry about it. I'm angry that they're pretending that this is reversible or they're pretending it's temporary. It's neither. Thank you for focusing on that. Could we talk? I'd like to make sure we cover two more things. One is the good news, and the other is the trials that you're facing. So just, there is a lot of good news on this front. I mean, WPATH, as you know, which is this gender ideologue radical activist group that was pushing these horrific policies. The numbers of people who are WPATH members has plummeted. Their credibility, I think, in the court has also plummeted. I know of at least one appellate court that said they're not, the de facto in charge organization. So that's good news. And the Tavistock Clinic, if you can just share with our readers, that's also been good news. Our viewers don't necessarily know what Tavistock is.
Sure. Yeah, let me go chronologically through a lot of the wins here. There's probably too many to count. So the first country to really put a stop to this was Finland. They conducted a systematic review of all the scientific literature. This is the gold standard in medicine, looking at all the different studies that have ever been done. And they found there's no evidence, of course, that this is helping kids. So they essentially put a complete stop to this. Sweden then followed with another systematic review. Again, no evidence to support this. They basically totally stopped it. England then followed. The Cass review, 388 pages long. Dr. Hilary Cass, a lifelong pediatrician, a lifelong leftist, I would say. She definitely leans left. This is not some right winger. And she found, of course, that this isn't helping kids. So in the UK, they have banned puberty blockers. The government has followed up with a ban. Even the leftist government followed up with a ban. West Streeting, the Minister of Health there. Scotland has done the same. They also banned cross-sex hormones in Scotland. We have some progress out of Denmark. We have now 27 states who have legislated a stop to this child abuse. A few of these states need to improve that legislation, but most of them are really good. And we even have in Northern Australia, they're stopping it. There's some progress in New Zealand. Even in Canada, my home country in Alberta, the Premier, Danielle Smith, stopped this for children under the age of 16. Now that for me is just a half measure, but it's a start and it's 100% better than nothing. So we're making progress all over the world. Tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions have learned about this. Everywhere I go, no matter where I go, I step out the hotel in Portugal 6 months ago, and within 5 seconds, some people knew who I was. So the message is getting out there. I've spoken at the UN. I was just featured on the big screen at the World Economic Forum because they were smart enough to take my picture outside where I was doing my thing, having conversations, and they spoke for a few minutes about the backlash. We have President Trump, who's passed brilliant executive orders stopping this. So we're winning everywhere. It just takes time to educate the entire world. But as we do, we're going to keep winning. And we now have lawsuits as well. There's Campbell Miller Payne with a lot of lawsuits. I think there are about 20 lawsuits overall. These are hugely important in the United States because these lawsuits are the route to ultimately stopping this. Because even though we won't be able to legislate an end to this in the blue states like Washington State or Minnesota or Maine or Vermont where they're crazy, well, guess what? The insurers aren't going to want to cover these losses anymore. And we have a lot of states also extending the statute of limitations. And what happened in Missouri, for example, there was a whistleblower from the gender clinic named Jamie Reed. She worked there for 4 years as case manager, oversaw 1,000 children come and go. She wrote an affidavit exposing everything I've said today. And they stopped it there, but the existing children who were already receiving puberty blockers were allowed to continue. But they extended the statute of limitations out 20, 30 years. So the lawyers for the gender clinic said, nuh-uh, too much liability. We're shutting it all down. So even though we can't get these blue states and these Democrats to go along with us, that's okay. We're going to keep winning in the court. And that's ultimately going to put a stop to this.
You put a big smile on my face. You know, doctor, lawyer, like I've learned a lot over the last few years that you can't always win based 100% on the truth, but based on the reality on the ground is that insurance companies don't want to do this. I'm also a big fan of lawsuits of people like Joanna Olson, Kennedy Olson, because if doctors see even 2 doctors, you know, getting brought up on charges on this, and I'm in favor of criminal battery for sure. This is not merely civil. Other doctors will be afraid. The doctors will fall, you know, they'll collapse like the sheep that most of the doctors are. I'm sorry to say, because I love being a doctor. So thank you for running through the wins. Now you've, like me, you know, you've changed your life to advocate for something that you know is, you know, against evil. What are the challenges that you face?
Oh my gosh. I don't like complaining, but it's not complaining. I guess it's just reality. Yeah, I get physically attacked and things like that. Probably 40 times that's happened. Most of these men who do it, I don't need to worry about, because the type of men who have a problem with me aren't the type you need to worry about physically. And I'm just being perfectly honest with you. I had a pretty, I guess, more severe attack in Montreal, about 6 guys, premeditated attack. And I ended up getting my arm broken as I was blocking a traffic cone that this guy was swinging at my head. I blocked it 4 times with my forearm, but there's no protection for your ulna there. And the base on those things is pretty heavy, so it snapped my ulna. But honestly, I don't know. Maybe I was born to fight. I think I'm just kind of a soldier, and I don't mind the fight at all. So I don't worry about all the attacks and the lying and all that. I do have a lawsuit coming up in Australia. I'm going to be there in about 2 weeks' time.
Tell us about it.
I'm essentially suing the government for a freedom of speech issue. Last year, around this time, they ordered X to take down one of my posts. So I had been critical of a woman named Teddy Cook. She's an Australian woman who says she's a man. She posts pictures of her mutilated body. She posts all sorts of things which are not appropriate for me to talk about. She wants government-funded childhood sex changes. She says trans-identified people have better sex when they're high on illicit drugs. She posts bestiality even. So naturally, Dr. Gold, she was appointed to the World Health Organization panel of experts to draft healthcare policy for trans-identified kids and adults. That's outrageous. She's an activist. She's not a doctor. She's just a member of this cult, essentially. So I wrote a post calling her a woman, because she is. And I said something like people with psychiatric disorders are writing the healthcare policies for people with psychiatric disorders, because it's true. Everywhere you go, it's like this. Joanna Olson Kennedy is married, by the way, to a trans-identified female, a woman who says she's a man. The head of WPATH is a man who says he's a woman. All around the Western world, all the people writing these healthcare policies are themselves either identifying as trans or intimately associated with someone who is. They are not objective. So I wrote this critical post. Australia ordered it taken down, the government. X forwarded me the takedown notice. I said, this is wonderful. This is beautiful. Let's blow this up. I'd forgotten about the tweet. And then millions of people saw it when I said, look what the Australian government's trying to do. So I also filed an appeal down under. And then incredibly, Elon Musk also filed an appeal for my post. So we have 2 separate appeals being heard at the same time. X's lawyers are involved. I have my own lawyers, thankfully funded by ADF International. And we're going to have fun. I've got 5 days of trial for my little post.
A couple of things I have to say. I'm sorry if it's just like fun. Like you, I think I was born to fight, I have to say. But I'm sorry that you broke an arm, and I was curious if anybody got arrested for that assault. Just, no.
No, this is Canada. This is Canada. That hardly ever happens.
I just
they
wanted
didn't even investigate.
Yeah, they don't. Right. There you go. I just want to say 1 or 2 things and then a question. So you just mentioned a couple of things that psychiatric patient, female, male, just said, let's clarify the facts. One of the saddest things about people who go through these procedures and these and these hormones is that the vast majority of them never have a normal sex life ever. And this is another reason why I know informed consent is not happening, because there's no world in which you're telling a 15-year-old boy that he's signing up for, life of no orgasms, and or that he knows what that means. But the incidence of anorgasmia, sorry to be blunt, but I am a doctor, the incidence of anorgasmia in people who've gone through these hormones and surgeries is well over 50. It's about 65, 70%, in addition to chronic wounds and all kinds of medical problems that they have. So it's a bald-faced lie to say they've got better sex life. They've got much, much, much worse, much reduced sexual function. Testosterone.
May I add one thing to that real
Yes,
quick?
please.
So Marcy Bowers is the president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. He says in a video, which I've tweeted out many times, when the boys especially start on puberty blockers at Tanner stage 2, so they're 11, 12 years old, he says literally none of them as adults have been able to have an orgasm. That's coming from the head of WPATH. So that's just another thing.
And that's the head
Obviously,
of people who are advocating for it. And you reminded me that and this is a term that's going to make any normal male sitting and watching this shudder. The boys end up, the males end up with micro penis. Their penis never grows. I'm old enough, to have grown up, men brag about this. This is the kind of thing that men brag about. There's nobody in the locker room bragging about, the micro penis. It's just horrific. And the lie is so big that I had to say something about that. You also mentioned the incidents that most of the people that are pushing this, that are in some kind of leadership role, some of them being listened to, they have their own issues that put them in this lane. I think that would surprise a lot of people to hear, but it's true that most of the people who are leaders in this are suffering from this problem themselves and in their lives. And for me, it looks like the old expression, misery loves company. I'm sorry for any degree of human misery. You're an empathic human being. You're sorry when other humans are suffering. But a suffering human being who looks out in the world and says, well, let me make everybody else suffer in the same way, is not a good human being. And that when you look into the personal lives of these people, the vast majority of them have some crazy element of dysfunction that they've then been put in a position to give to the rest of the world. And as you know, we don't have time, but we talked about in the movie, What is a Doctor? I hope you've seen it. But What is a Doctor? The documentary we did on this issue, it goes over the etiology of why this transgender movement has gotten so big. And it was really at the foot of this doctor who was very, very disturbed, John Money, very disturbed, very sick. And I just want to make sure all of our viewers know that the leadership people, many of them have this sickness themselves and are not people you should be turning to for guidance. So tell us, the Australia case is in about, when is the date of the Australia case? Is that mid-April?
So trial starts March 31st. It goes to April 4th. X's lawyers actually have some hearings going on before that. They're trying to discredit the expert reports. So Australia has this position called an e-safety commissioner. It's this woman, her name is Julia Grant. She's actually American, but she censors the internet. You might remember this bishop at a church in Australia a year ago was giving his sermon when an Islamic terrorist walked down the aisle and stabbed him, and he lost his eye.
Yes.
They ordered that taken off the internet. Now, they lost in a subsequent court case against X, but they don't want that aired, of course, for ideological reasons. And it's the same with this. They don't want people telling the truth about anything trans related. There's another woman in Australia who had her post taken down. She worked for the Australian Breastfeeding Association for 15 years, and she objected to men chest feeding. So they censored her post and ordered it taken down. This is just unadulterated 1984 style censorship.
Right.
We can't let it stand. So that's why I'm suing. These expert reports are like 60 pages long, analyzing how hateful my post was. One of them even put together a word cloud based on all of my replies to my post. I mean, it's totally absurd. But I'm going to have a lot of fun because I've had tens of thousands of these conversations. I've been doing this for 4.5 years, and there's nothing they're going to say that I haven't dealt with 1,000 times. So I think it's going to be glorious.
Right. And just to remind everybody, George Orwell in the book 1984, the protagonist was blocked from saying 2 + 2 = 4. And you have to wonder why the powerful people, the elite, didn't care if he said 2 + 2 = 5. Nobody really cares if you run around saying things that are false. There's so much power in the truth that people with another agenda are very interested in suppressing the truth. So you're trying to say 2 + 2 = 4. And I'm sorry you have to go through this, but I'm grateful as an American, as a free citizen. I think you're going to win this one. Not that it's easy, but we will definitely follow it on my own X, Dr. Simone Gold, and we will cross post. And I'm I'm glad you're taking it to the fight. Like you're not just walking away from the fight. Not that I expect that. Is there
Thank you.
anything?
And I just want to leave your viewers with one last thing. It's a positive message. It's the truth, and it's extraordinarily effective when you're having these conversations. With the activists, with the angry people, if you say things they agree with, they have nothing. If you say, look, our children are beautiful just as they are, there's no right or wrong way to be a girl or a boy, they can't disagree. And it throws them because they have this blind spot where they simultaneously think stereotypes are bad, but then if a girl doesn't conform to stereotypes, they now want to sterilize her and cut off her breasts. I mean, these two things don't add up. But give the positive message. It's always much more effective. The world responds to positivity. Our children are beautiful just as they are. No drugs or scalpels needed. And that's just the plain fact of the matter. There's no such thing as a transgender child. They're called girls and boys, and they're perfect just as they are, as Donald Trump mentioned in his State of the Union address last night.
I want to also share with people a couple of very good resources. Dr. Miriam Grossman's book, Lost in Trans Nation. So if this is an issue you're facing or just an issue that you're very curious to know more about, the best resource, I think it's the Bible for this subject. It has a lot of resources in there for parents who are actually going through this and the right ways to handle this. There's better and worse ways to handle this if you're facing this. Lost in Trans Nation. Also the movie that we produced, What is a Doctor? Reviews a lot of this information. Please follow Billboard Chris. I want to thank you. It's really a pleasure to talk with you. We will follow your case in Australia, and truth will out. Truth will win.
Thank you, Dr. Gold. I'll see you out on the battlefield somewhere.
That's right.
Keep
I'll
up the
see you on the
fight.
battlefield. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me on the Gold Report, where we inspire you to be 10% more courageous. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.